St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. Many preachers will begin their sermon with an opening illustration or something that grabs people's attentions. It can be something relevant, like a current event in the news, or it can be something common, something that we could all connect with, or it can be something funny to put us in a good mood, and usually the opening illustration will introduce listeners to the main idea in the sermon. For example, Jesus did this very well. If he wanted to talk about the kingdom of heaven and he knew that his listeners were all farmers, he might want to talk about seeds or soil or wheat and weeds. Or if he wanted to talk about how God gave people second chances, he could start with a story about a father who had two sons where the younger son got a second chance, the prodigal. Having a good introduction at the beginning of a sermon can make the difference between keeping people engaged and sitting on the edge of their pews or putting them to sleep, which I have experience with here. And if you have a lot of time to fill, say 20, 25 minutes, having a really long opening introduction is a great way to fill the time. This morning, we're looking at the Gospel according to Mark. And unlike Matthew's Gospel, which we looked at last week, Mark doesn't waste a lot of ink in his opening introduction with a long and lengthy genealogy. Matthew's audience, if you remember from last week's rather lengthy introduction about the four different perspectives, his audience were sort of like those folks waiting at the bus stop. They had time on their hands. They were very patient people. And so to go through a very long list of names, 42 generations in all, they had time for that. But the Gospel, according to Mark, dispenses with lengthy introductions because Mark's audience was very different. And today we'll not only look at his very short introduction, but talk about his unique perspective and what he wanted us to know about the person of Jesus Christ. This morning we are looking at two passages from the Gospel according to Mark. The first passage, Mark chapter 1, verses 1, 2, and 3, is his opening introduction, and the second passage, later on, Mark chapter 10, verses 43 through 45, is a key theme in his Gospel. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, 2, and 3 in the NIV, in your Pew Bibles, it is on page 1073. You can follow along in their Pew Bibles or follow up on the screen above me. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's Word. John the Baptist prepares the way. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, "I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him." Mark chapter 10, verses 43, 44, and 45 on page 1087. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples. "Indeed, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The author of our second gospel was a man by the name of Mark. Mark was his Roman name, which meant the hammer. John was his Jewish name, which meant the grace of God. And in several places in the Bible, he's referred to by both names, John Mark. In Acts chapter 12, verse 12, when Peter escaped from prison and went to look for his own people, this is what is written. He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Then later in the very same chapter, verse 25, he is mentioned again as one of the traveling companions on Paul's first mission trip. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. Just from these two passages alone, we know that Mark, also John Mark, was from a well-connected family who was part of the larger community who supported and followed Jesus Christ. The fact that after Peter escaped from prison, he immediately went to Mark's home shows you his family's prominence. And because of Mark's close proximity to the number one disciple, Peter, many believe Peter was actually the source of Mark's gospel material, which explains how even though Mark was not one of the original disciples, he had access to all of those stories. Then there's the fact that Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on their very first mission trip, shows you not only how Mark was connected with the disciples, but also the spreading of the gospel and the starting of many churches. Now, the Gospel of Mark was written for a different audience than, say, the Gospel of Matthew. If you were not here last Sunday, we shared how Matthew wrote primarily for his own people a Jewish context. That's why in Matthew's gospel, there are so many quotes back referring to the Old Testament and the prophets, because if your readers were Jews or Jewish, that was very important. But Mark's gospel has very few references to the Old Testament, and that's because his audience were Roman Gentiles. So there's these little telltale signs in Mark's gospel that he's writing to a different audience than, say, Matthew. Instead of telling the time according to like a Jewish clock or calendar, like the first hour, fifth hour, sixth hour, Mark switches over to Roman time, midnight, shortly before dawn, those kind of references. Then when it came to Jewish customs, instead of assuming that his readers would automatically know what these were, Mark took the time to carefully explain them to them. So this was like the case in Jewish ceremonial washing. In Mark chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, it says, "The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles." Now, if your readers were Jews, you wouldn't have to explain any of that because it would just be known, common knowledge. But since Mark is writing to Gentiles, he carefully explains Jewish customs. So that's a little bit about the person of Mark and who his audience was. Let me share some unique things now about the gospel he wrote itself. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest among the four Gospels. And with just 16 chapters, or a little bit over 11,000 words, that's almost half as long as the Gospel of Luke, according to word count. In Mark's Gospel, there is no genealogy. That's only in Matthew and Luke. And again, that was probably because Jesus' ancestry wasn't important to Mark's non-Jewish readers. So, being the shortest of the four Gospels, in Mark's version, there are very few parables recorded, 8 to be exact. Compare that to Luke, 24 Gospels written. But surprisingly, even though being the shortest Gospel, Mark includes the most number of miracles Jesus performed. So, what does that mean? It means Mark wants to show Jesus not as someone who talks a lot and tells a lot of stories, but someone who does a lot of things. Less talk, less dialogue, no Sermon on the Mount, but more miracles, more action, more doing stuff. Remember, Mark's gospel is the action gospel. Just for comparison, to give you a sense of what I mean, you all know the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. It's a well-known story. In Matthew's version of that story, there's a lot of dialogue that goes back and forth between Jesus and the devil. The devil begins by tempting Jesus to turn stones into loaves of bread, and Jesus responds by quoting a verse from the Old Testament. It is written, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." That's a classic Matthew passage, a quote from the Old Testament. Then the devil tempted Jesus to jump off a high point in the temple, and Jesus replied by saying, "It is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Then there was another temptation followed by another quote, and in Matthew's version of that story, Jesus and the devil went back and forth with a very lengthy dialogue, which was fine for the Gospel of Matthew. But listen to Mark's condensed version of that entire story in Mark chapter 1. At once, the Spirit sent Jesus out into the desert, and he was in the desert 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. That's all that Mark wrote. The end. No dialogue. No quotes from the Old Testament. No going back and forth between Jesus and the devil. Just short and sweet and to the point, which is the reason why many people like the Gospel of Mark. Then there's this literary style of writing which is very unique to Mark's Gospel. Mark used specific certain words over and over and over and over again in writing his gospel. They are unique words to his gospel. He uses the word in English immediately more than 40 times. And he uses the word to propel the story forward with a sense of speed and urgency. Also, of the 16 chapters in Mark's gospel, 13 of them begin with the word and. In the Greek, it's the word kai. Now, if you were to go home and look up all the different versions of the Bible, it's not going to be there, because in most translations, they clean it up because that's not proper English. So they cleaned it up and took the word out so it reads more properly. But in the original Greek, the word kai appears at 13 of the 16 chapters at the very beginning, and then also in almost every major paragraph in Mark's gospel. You know how you're not supposed to start sentences with the word and? Did you learn that in grade school? Well, Mark does it all throughout his gospel. It's like every chapter, every paragraph was a run-on sentence. If he could have, he would have told his entire gospel all in a single breath, because Mark didn't know where to pause in the story to take a single breath. Let me slow things down for a moment. Let's go back to Mark chapter 1, verse 1, and take a closer look at his opening sentence to see what he's talking about. Liam or Mike, can you put that up there? Thanks. John the Baptist prepares the way, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We'll stop right there for a moment. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Our NIV translation uses the word gospel right there in the opening sentence. Many other translations use the word good news. The beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The NRSV translation, the Message translation, the New Living Translation, as well as many countless others, instead of using the word gospel, they use the word good news. And that's okay. Why? Because that's actually what the word means. The gospel is good news. Would you all say that with me? The gospel is good news. Mark's gospel, however, was the only gospel in our Bible to start his narrative that way by using that particular word, gospel. Matthew doesn't use the word, Luke doesn't use it, John doesn't use it. Mark is the only one to start his introduction of Jesus Christ by saying, folks, you're in for some good news. Now, the original word in Greek was not gospel, it wasn't good news. It was a specific word you might be familiar with, evangelion. We get the word evangelism from that word. And back in Mark's time, the word was not originally used in regards to Jesus Christ or the story about him. Originally, it was used by the Romans or Greeks to announce the birth of a royal heir or the enthronement of a new king, or to convey the news of victory in battle. The birthday of Augustus was the beginning for the world of the gospel that comes to men through him, a sentence from historical archives that used that particular word, gospel. So Mark took a word that was well known and used, the word gospel, and he was the first to apply it to what he wanted to say about Jesus Christ. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ. To say it even more simply, Jesus is good news. Matthew didn't start his gospel this way. By the way, he started with a genealogy, which one way to look at that is that's historical information. That's old news, if you will. But Mark started his gospel by saying Jesus is gospel. Jesus is good news. Let that sink in for a moment. Jesus is good news. The gospel is good news. It seems like lately every time you turn on the TV, turn to a news channel, or you turn on the radio and listen to the news, the kind of news that seems to grab all the attention isn't good news, it's bad news. Fires all over the islands, hurricanes, tropical storms and floods washing away bridges and roads, countries at war, economies collapsing, politicians arguing with one another. Where's the good news? The Gospel of Mark wants you to know from the very start, this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ. I read something funny this past week I want to share in regards to good news versus bad news. It was entitled, Pastors, Good News and Bad News. Good news, Pastor. You baptized 7 people today in the river. Bad news, you lost 2 of them in the swift currents. Good news, Pastor. The Women's Guild voted to send you a get well card. Bad news, the vote only passed 31 to 30. Good news, Pastor. The session accepted your job description the way you wrote it. Bad news, they were so impressed by it, they formed a search committee to find someone capable of filling the position. Good news, Pastor. Church attendance rose dramatically the last 3 weeks. Bad news, you were on vacation. Now, when Mark began his gospel by saying the beginning of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, many scholars believe he chose that specific word because during the time when Mark wrote his gospel, there was a lot of bad news going around. What do I mean? Mark wrote his gospel somewhere between the years 66 to 70 AD, and it was thought that he wrote this while in Rome. Well, in Rome, in the year 64 AD, something terrible took place The entire city was on fire. Rome was burning. The Great Fire of Rome took place July 18th, the year 64 AD, and after 6 days, when they were finally able to put out the last flames, 70% of the entire city had burnt down to ash, to rubble. You know how after a great fire is put out, the initial response, shock, grief, sadness. Well, after the tears are wiped away, what kicks in? Anger. We're seeing this right now, right? On the island, on Maui. Now that the fires have been put out, guess what's going on? Everyone is looking for someone to blame. So back in Rome, back in the year 64 AD, after 6 days of fire, after 70% of the city was completely gone, the emperor named Nero was looking for someone to blame, and he pointed his finger at Christians, saying, Christians burned down the city. Christians are to blame for all this destruction. So needless to say, it was bad news to be a Christian, especially in the city of Rome. Anywhere in the Roman Empire when all of this took place, it was bad news to be a follower of Jesus Christ. In Rome, in the neighboring cities, all over the empire, because persecution then broke out and Christians were put to death, blamed for the fires, and if you were caught as a follower of Jesus Christ, good luck. So Mark had his work cut out. When he started to write his gospel, this was going on in the background. This was the news on the radio. This was what was playing on TV. It was a world full of bad news, and he wanted to show Jesus was the good news. The beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We're good people. Isn't that the same challenge the church faces today? In a world full of bad news, we are to go and be messengers of the gospel, the good news. Amen? That's Mark chapter 1, verse 1. Then he continues his introduction by doing something interesting, something a little unconventional. Verse 2 and 3 reads this way. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messengers ahead of you who will prepare your way, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Mark began his gospel by introducing John the Baptist, not Jesus. And John the Baptist's role was to proclaim the coming of the Lord. Why did he do that? I'll cut to a quick analogy. Do you remember a long time ago when Johnny Carson used to host The Tonight Show? Well, when the show opened up, it wasn't Johnny Carson who came out first. Who was it? Ed McMahon. Ed would say a few words. He might tell you who was going to be on the show. And then with a great, big, booming voice, he would say, you know, by saying that, you dated yourself. But that's what Mark was doing. At the start of his gospel show, it's John the Baptist who first appears on the gospel stage, and with a great, big, booming voice, he says, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And the reason why he uses John the Baptist was because in Mark's time, that's how you shared the gospel. If you want to announce the birth of a royal heir or the enthronement of a king, you had a messenger go from town to town and shout the gospel. And so in the very same way, Mark uses John the Baptist almost as a literary tool to do exactly what people did during his day. So, knowing that, when the church wanted to come up with a symbol for the Gospel of Mark, they thought of the second window, a lion, as the symbol for Mark's Gospel. That's our second window. We took a picture of it, we blew it up. It's hard to see sometimes. Listen to what is written in this booklet about our sanctuary. I'm quoting about Mark's gospel window. It reads, "The lion represents Saint Mark. The lion is said to signify royalty in allusion to the kingly office of Jesus. Mark's gospel begins, 'The voice of one crying in the wilderness,' and this suggests the roar of a lion." So that's you, St. Mark's. You are a lion. Let me hear you roar. I didn't say meow. With the time I have left, let me talk about our second passage, the one from Mark chapter 10, verses 43 through 45. Liam, can you put that second one up? Here it is. Context. Jesus was talking to his disciples right before the triumphal entry, right before Holy Week, if you will. And earlier on in this very same chapter, two of the disciples, James and John, very arrogantly approached Jesus, and they asked if they could sit at his right and to his left when Jesus comes into his kingdom. Their request clearly showed they misunderstood all of this kingdom conversation. So Jesus responded to them this way: "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all, for even the Son of Man," referring to himself, "did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This verse is considered a main theme in the Gospel of Mark, the theme of service, the theme of serving others. Even a chapter earlier, in Mark chapter 9, verse 35, Jesus called the disciples together and said, "Any of you who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." So who was Jesus in Mark's gospel? Jesus was the Son of God who came to do the Father's will. Jesus was the suffering servant who, in spite of persecution, was faithful all the way to the cross. Jesus was the good news who, in a world full of bad news, wanted to change the narrative. Jesus was a man of action, always on the road, always going from town to town, healing the sick, the lame, and curing the blind. If Mark's gospel was the action gospel, then Jesus was our action hero, and his invitation to follow him and to be messengers of the good news is also a call to action to be of service to others. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and to provide for those who grieve in Zion." And all God's people said,